The Caitlin Clark takeover continues. Record-breaking, record-shattering numbers in the Indiana Fever taking on the Atlanta Dream. And Stephanie White has exposed herself.
The Caitlin Clark takeover is not slowing down, not even a little bit. This past weekend, she helped deliver the most watched WNBA game in cable television history, and the numbers are honestly hard to even process. But that's only half of tonight's story. Because while Clark was breaking records, her own head coach was in the middle of explaining a late-game strategy that has fans questioning whether the Fever's offense has a serious problem heading into the postseason. Let's get into everything. Let's start with the numbers, because they are absolutely staggering. This past Sunday, ESPN aired the Indiana Fever against the Atlanta Dream, and according to numbers released by ESPN PR, the broadcast averaged 2.6 million viewers, with a peak audience hitting 4 million. Let that sink in for a second. 4 million people, at the exact same moment, tuned in to watch this game. That number made it the most watched WNBA regular season broadcast in the history of cable television. Not just a good number, not just a strong week. The single highest rated regular season WNBA game cable has ever aired. And it wasn't a small bump either. That audience was up 178% compared to last year's ESPN regular season average. WNBA programming across ESPN's networks overall is up 16% year over year. Even the pregame coverage saw a massive jump. WNBA Countdown, the league's pregame show, averaged 452,000 viewers leading into the broadcast, up 33% from last year. To put it in perspective just how much of an outlier this is, look at what happened right after it. The second game of ESPN's Sunday doubleheader, which featured the Phoenix Mercury hosting a night celebrating Diana Taurasi against the Portland Fire, still drew a very respectable 1.4 million viewers. That's a strong number on its own, but it's still a significant drop-off from the 2.6 million average, and nowhere close to that 4 million peak from the Fever Dream game. And realistically, a big chunk of that second game's audience is simply the lead-in effect. Fans who were already tuned in from the first broadcast sticking around afterward. The bottom line here is simple. Whatever network Caitlin Clark is playing on any given night, is delivering historic numbers for women's basketball. This isn't a case of the whole league suddenly getting hot at the same time. It's one player fundamentally changing the trajectory of an entire broadcast partnership over and over again, every time she steps on the floor. Now here's where the story shifts. Because while all of this record-breaking viewership was happening, Fever head coach Stephanie White was addressing something entirely different in her post-game comments. And it sparked a real conversation among fans about how she's using her two best players down the stretch of games. To understand this, you have to go back to the Fever's win over the Atlanta Dream itself. It was an overtime thriller, and it came down to the final stretch. But here's the detail that stood out to a lot of people watching closely. Over the final 5 minutes of the fourth quarter, and through the entire overtime period, Caitlin Clark did not attempt a single shot. Not one. Instead, the offense in that stretch ran almost entirely through Kelsey Mitchell, who was in the middle of an extended streak of scoring 20 or more points a game. To be clear, Mitchell delivered. She hit big shots late in overtime when the Fever needed them most, and there's no denying she's capable of putting a team on her back and getting buckets against just about anyone. But the pattern itself, going away from Clark entirely for the game's most important stretch, raised eyebrows. And then, just one game later, against the Toronto Tempo, the concern about that approach became a lot more real. Clark herself mentioned afterward just how brutal the conditions were in that arena, saying it was extremely hot in the building, and pointing out that having 19,000 people packed into a gym with no air conditioning simply doesn't make sense. That's a fair point on its own. Arenas hosting that many fans should have proper climate control. But in that same game, Kelsey Mitchell's body reportedly began overheating to the point where it affected her ability to keep playing, echoing a similar issue she dealt with in a game against the Las Vegas Aces last season. And notably, she wasn't the only professional athlete on that floor dealing with the same heat. Other players managed to push through the conditions without the same level of physical shutdown. When Mitchell wasn't able to go at full strength in that game, the Fever's offense reportedly looked completely out of sync, almost like a team that didn't have a backup plan once its go-to closer wasn't available. That's the exact concern that's now being raised about Stephanie White's late-game approach. If the fourth quarter and overtime strategy has become built almost entirely around funneling everything through Kelsey Mitchell, what happens on a night when Mitchell isn't at her best, whether that's from heat, fatigue, an off-shooting night, or an injury down the stretch of a long playoff push? Based on how the Fever looked without her against Toronto, that's a real question worth asking. Adding fuel to this conversation were White's own comments about Mitchell after the Atlanta win. She was asked about Mitchell's ability to create shots late in games, and her answer is what's gotten people talking. White said, quote, "I don't see the company she's in. It's incredible. She just can get a shot at any time. She gets a shot for herself. Her gravity creates shots for everybody else. It's nice to know that you can give her the ball and let her go to work. There aren't a lot of players that can just create those kind of shots that she does. And I think for us, it's almost like a crutch at times. It's like, give it to her and let her go to work." That word, crutch, is really the center of this whole discussion. White herself used that language to describe how the offense leans on Mitchell in those critical moments. And to her credit, she wasn't hiding from it. She was being honest about the approach. But when your own head coach describes a strategy as a crutch, that's a pretty clear acknowledgement that this isn't necessarily a fully developed, multi-option offense down the stretch of games. It's leaning heavily on one player's individual scoring ability to close things out. White followed that up by praising Mitchell's work ethic more broadly, saying, quote, "I think it's just a result of Kelsey's hard work, man. She grinds. She loves this game. She just wants to play. She doesn't get caught up in any of the nonsense. And she just brings something new every year. And I'm just proud of her." Nobody's disputing that Mitchell has earned this level of trust from her coaching staff through hard work and consistent production. That part isn't in question at all. The concern fans are raising isn't about whether Kelsey Mitchell deserves the ball in big moments. It's about what happens when the offense doesn't have a secondary plan built around getting Caitlin Clark involved in that same stretch of the game. Clark is sitting on the most Player of the Week awards in the league this season, arguably making the single biggest statistical and commercial impact of any player in the WNBA, and yet in the biggest moments of a close overtime game, she went the final 5 minutes plus all of overtime without a single shot attempt. That disconnect, a league record-shattering, viewership-driving superstar getting completely sidelined in crunch time while her team leans entirely on one closer, is exactly what's fueling this conversation heading into the postseason. Because playoff basketball is unforgiving. Opposing defenses scout tendencies relentlessly, and if a team's late-game offense becomes predictable enough that everyone in the building knows the ball is going to one specific player every single possession, that's exactly the kind of pattern a great defensive coordinator will find a way to take away when it matters most. So where does this leave the Fever heading into the stretch run of the season? On one hand, you have a franchise that is currently the single biggest driver of attention and viewership in the history of women's basketball on cable television, powered almost entirely by Caitlin Clark's presence on the floor. On the other hand, you have a head coach who has openly admitted that her fourth-quarter offense leans on a single player as what she herself called a crutch, and a supporting cast that looked lost in a recent game when that primary option wasn't at full strength. If the Fever want to make a real, sustained postseason run, the numbers suggest they're going to need more balance in those closing minutes. Not less trust in Kelsey Mitchell. She's clearly earned every bit of that trust. But more development of what Caitlin Clark can do in those same high-leverage possessions, so the offense isn't completely dependent on one player carrying the entire fourth quarter and overtime workload by herself. For now, the record books say the Fever, and Caitlin Clark specifically, are doing something no team in WNBA history has done on cable television. That part of the story is undeniable. Whether Stephanie White adjusts her closing lineup approach before the postseason arrives is the part still left to be seen. Let us know in the comments what you think. Should the Fever be running more of the offense through Caitlin Clark in crunch time, or has Kelsey Mitchell earned the right to be the team's primary closer? Drop your take below. If you want to stay updated on everything happening with the Fever and around the WNBA this season, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update.